Welcome to the module on the theory of economic regulation by Stigler. The concept of regulation is deep-rooted in a societal process of transformation. So by regulation, what do we mean? Regulation is generally defined as a legislation imposed by the government on individuals and private sector firms to regulate and modify economic behaviors. So by regulation, it means any kind of changes in the law or in the legislative procedures so that the individuals and the private sector firms actually react to it in accordance with the government norms and thereby modify the economic behaviors as well as the social behaviors of a state. Conflict can occur between public services and commercial procedures because that is what we have seen in a capitalistic society, how maximization of profit may actually be the capitalist owners, and that can be done at the mercy of the working class. And that is how the conflict theory has been already proposed. Interest of the people using the services, because in most of the cases market failure takes place whereby the price of the commodity cannot be easily evaluated, which calls for the intervention of the state, and also the interests which are not directly involved in transactions, because thereby comes the role of externalities or the external forces. So most governments therefore have some form of control or regulation to manage these conflicts, because where the role of the state is very much involved in terms of a monitoring agency, in terms of the surveillance that is being needed to look into the conflict or to mitigate any kind of disruptions. Regulatory economics is an application of the law by the government or regulatory agencies for various purposes, thus by mitigating the market failure, protecting the environment and economic management. Because whenever we go for any kind of regulatory body or regulatory agency, the main motto of such agency is to actually reduce the disruptions and make a comfortable ambience for all the stakeholders to survive, whether it is from the environmental point of view or from the management point of view or relating to any kind of market failure. So moreover, what do we mean by the word of regulatory capture? Because any sort of regulatory agency will basically form some procedures and some laws, and there will be certain stipulated objectives which will look for the regulatory capture. So it is a process through which a regulatory agency will create to act in the public interest, because this regulatory body is not actually owned by the private units. It has to look for the common interest or the collective interest of the society, because any such kind of private units end up in conflicts which can be done at a private basis or case-to-case basis. But a regulatory agency has the sole responsibility to reduce this conflict and to come up in an amicable situation for both. Instead, advances the commercial or special concerns of interest groups that dominate the industry if it is meant to regulate. In most of the cases, when the monopolization becomes more and more proactive, the government intervenes and wants to check the monopoly power so as to save or protect the interest of the common masses. Regulatory capture is a risk to which an agency is exposed by its very nature. It is also a risk-taking behavior of a regulatory agency to intervene when capitalists own a larger proportion of wealth in the society. Regulation controls the sale and consumption of alcohol and other prescriptive drugs, as well as food businesses, provision of personal residential care. So any such kind of activities whereby the government actually comes up with any harmful goods or any such kind of regulations which is affecting the common interest, in such cases the government comes in and regulatory activities are taken. This goes back to the most important profounder of economic regulation, who is called George Stigler. So thereby we explored some of the George Stigler's views on the concept of regulation. First of all, we look by the definition of a regulator. So who is a regulator? A regulator's special interest pressure from the producers and electoral pressure from the consumers. So the regulator is actually a balancing unit who will take up the initial stress from the producers, because the producer interests have to be protected, as well as from the consumer's democracy right, the interest of the consumers also to be looked upon. So the special interest pressure is always more persuasive and producers always in, because producers have a constant exercising control over the wealth and thereby their interest has to be taken care of, but without compromising with the consumer's benefit. Regulations are passed only for the benefit for large firms, not for the benefit or protection of the consumers. So this was the view of the Stigler, that whenever regulation will be passed, it will take up the interest of the producers. Initially it was thought so, and consumers will not be benefited from that. Subsidies are not good, they encourage new entrants into the market, so producers gain only a short-term benefit. So whenever we go by a capitalistic mode, and in a capitalistic society, it is always said that any kind of social transformation or any kind of regulatory body will not be good, because there the subsidies grant will come up, and that will basically make the new entrants to come up, in the sense that more people will want to get the benefit of the subsidies, and that will make the working class to dominate or to come up in a larger number. And that is the major point of obstruction by the capitalist. Protectionism, on the other hand, limits the entry into the market and regulates favors in this method. So instead of subsidies, some kind of protective policy has been propounded by the Stigler in its traditional views on regulation. Moreover, the fundamental asset that is controlled by the state is the power to coerce. That is how it comes up that any group that can control how this power is can be profit. So thereby we get back to again the capitalistic doctrines of Marx and other capitalistic societies, where the thought process says that the profit generation is the basic objective of the society, so that cannot be compromised by getting more subsidies or by making the working class to get more favors. And that also being embedded within the theory of regulation by the Stigler. So according to Stigler, any kind of regulation should have the motto of favoring the producers and not the consumers, and also this kind of policy will make the profit not to be compromised under any context. Since we are self-interested actors, we will seek to get state coercive power to support our interest. Why they are saying self-interested? Because everybody's vested interest in the private investment model or in the private interest model. Because hereby all the agents go for their private profit maximization without any joint profit maximization. So in such kind of private maximizing models, the most important objective is to seek the profit, and in order to do so, state power is needed or state intervention is required, but not in terms of benefiting the consumers, but basically benefiting the producers at most. So this basically gets into that how the demand for regulation and the supply of regulation can be controlled. So Stigler looks only at the demand for regulation. How that is being done? Demand by the two economic agents, namely the producers and the consumers. Largely ignoring the supply side calculus, that is, ignores the regulator's motivations. Why the regulator will come in place? What will be the incentive for the regulatory agency? That has not been pointed out by the Stigler views. Stigler is only concerned about how the basic principles of capitalistic society can be protected or can be in place despite so many modifications or so many changes. So in all of these principles, he wants to say that the objective of the producers and the consumers will be taken care of, where producers will be more benefited and consumers will not be given a free space in this particular arena. Moreover, Stigler says that he does touch the supply side, slightly pointing out that legislatures want political support, campaign contributions, future employment, and so on. That means supply side means how the institution or how the regulatory agency needs to be funded. That is the supply side he wants to point out. So any kind of regulatory agency can be funded by any kind of political support, whereby they can enjoy some kind of political patronage, or by the campaign where the fund generation can take place, or by giving some kind of livelihood strategies, that is future employment, and any other unfair practices might be can engage. So the supply side dynamics is only on the funding of the regulatory agency, but not delving into the motivations why that agency will come up. Mostly it will be dominated by the demand side factors, which will be derived from the consumers and the producers. Moreover, by under-emphasizing the supply side, he ends with an unrealistic conclusion that consumers always lose. This is one of the major critics of the Stigler theory because consumers will be losing and the regulatory bodies will be exercising their control. In that way, the society cannot survive too far. That means in the long run, there will be some kind of symbols or indications that the society will break down. This is because the supply side is already underemphasized and the consumers will be losing. That is the perceived notion of the Stigler. Peltzman's 1976 modification of Stigler's model corrects this problem, resulting in a far more realistic predictions. That means in 1976, a new politician or political economist comes up who says that Stigler's model is ignoring consumers, but that cannot be do so. So when we refer to the weaknesses, Stigler sounds as if he's asserting an iron law that regulation only serves industry. This is actually a very biased way of proceeding with a regulatory agency or placing the regulatory agency in the future. Yet it's easy to highlight selected examples where businesses have almost certainly not benefited from the policies. Because whenever we say that the businesses are benefited from the policies, it means that they are basically the capitalist owners and they are the leaders and thereby they are getting the majority of the surpluses. But Stigler leaves key concept poorly defined or treated in simplistic terms. Because the most strong criticism is that any regulatory agency will benefit the producers and also will make the capitalists to grow in a more larger size and consumers will be losing. But that is not there in the basic economic definition of regulation. Economic definition of regulation is basically a balancing act where it mitigates the interest of both the stakeholders and making the process to be more flexible and convenient. This gets back to more of the weaknesses of the Stigler's perspective. Stigler's main observation that businesses seek regulation to disadvantage their competitors was hardly novel at the time, published in the Theory of Economic Regulation. Because according to Stigler, it says that businesses seek regulation to disadvantage their competitors. This is making the kind of a rival relationship among the firms, and that is how the competitive model will work on, according to Stigler. In any kind of an oligopolistic market, when there are few producers, this rivalry is very much observed, that whenever a business firm or a leader takes up a strategy, and in that way the other opponent or the rival ends up in a back footing. So this is basically being done to make the competitors at disadvantage. But a regulatory body should not ideally or principally create such kind of discrimination or biasness. So this is one of the major weaknesses that Stigler wants to point out, but it did not work on. Stigler's empirical analysis is crude and his findings are far from compelling. Because the empirical findings are basically not very much generalized. It may be very selective or case-to-case basis. Two brief case studies were state trucking regulation and state occupational licensing laws. This is making the regulation to be more and more inefficient in general because it is creating a biased policy. Stigler theory does not explain the emergence of extensive consumer and environmental regulation in the 70s. Because how the environmental issues are coming up, taking care of the externality problem. Because any kind of industrial unit can create some kind of negative production externalities, but all this must be absorbed within the Stigler model. So this kind of treatment is not there in the Stigler's approach, where regulatory body will only favor the capitalist or the producers at the cost of consumers. Now we move on to the Stigler's economic theory of regulation after encompassing the criticisms that are being placed. George Stigler's article, The Theory of Economic Regulation, is one of the most influential political economy accounts of regulation. So what is that being done? It shifted from the prevailing explanation for regulation from a public interest model to a rational choice model. So whenever we look for the public interest model, it is basically the interest of the common man or the collective interest that is being emphasized. But when we go for a rational choice model, where we actually initiate on the maximizing principles of the consumers and the producers in an optimizing framework, because that is how the regulatory body will perform. Because each of the stakeholders have their specific objectives to be fulfilled, where the regulatory body will come in place. So that is, it shifted regulatory scholars' thinking from a model that once viewed regulation as emerging naturally from a mere existence of a market failure to a model that sees regulation as a response to influence by businesses seeking to erect barriers against potential competitors. That means this is very much important as a point of departure between the two thinking processes. The first thinking process says that whenever we are developing any model where regulation is being considered for the common interest or a public interest, it is basically resulting from the market failure. When does market fail? Market fails whenever the external cost cannot be checked or cannot be absorbed. For example, any kind of externality created from any production cannot be captured by the price mechanism. Wherever we know that industry go for profit maximization, so industry's marginal cost only takes care of the private cost or cost incurred over the cost of production, payment made through the factors of production. But whenever an industry is in an operative process, it emits certain smoke, for example, creates certain health hazards, but it does not take care of the marginal social cost that it imposes on the society. Because the environmental degradation takes place and this cost is never included within the marginal private cost or the marginal cost. So under that situation, the market price of the final product, which only captured the marginal private cost, will not be capturing the marginal social cost. And hence, externality will come up and this will never be recovered by the price. So under that situation, market fails and thereby calls for any external unit or external agency to solve this problem. And this is none other than the government or any kind of regulatory body. So this type of regulatory body, as it is intervening or making an interference in the model, is because of the market failure only. And that was done from a public interest point of view. But according to Stigler, it goes into the rational choice model. So this is a departure from a public choice model to a rational choice model. So what is a rational choice model? It says that it is basically a response to influence by businesses seeking to erect barriers against potential competitors. Because here the businesses are mainly considered to go for a regulatory body to make their policies, procedures more rationalized and more streamlined. That is how they can come up with better business models, investment projections, and also will be contributing to the productivity. This is basically making the business models more simplistic without any rigidities in action. Moreover, it is said that the proper role of the government was to correct the private market failure that prevented the attainment of marginal cost pricing. That is what is being said, that whenever we go for a marginal cost pricing, it's a private move. Because it is the private marginal cost which is always equated with the price so that we can get the better reflection of the private cost. But actually in a society, there is also another component of social cost which can degrade the environmental problems. So under that situation, government plays an important role to correct the private market failures, and if it is done in a macro perspective, then it is an overall correction can be done. Moreover, it is said by different kind of applied economic analysis of regulation that was then largely descriptive. Because in most of the cases it was descriptive in the sense that it was qualitative and subjective in nature. And its main tendency was to show how the regulatory institution constrained departures from marginal cost pricing. Because any kind of regulatory body will be making the marginal cost pricing to be inefficient, that is the proof of the model, and to come up with the marginal social cost, and that is the only objective of regulatory body to have in a society. Monopoly was viewed as a main barrier to marginal cost pricing. So one of the main barriers of this kind of marginal cost pricing has been monopoly, because it is basically inhibiting the competition, and natural monopoly occupied center stage in the economics of regulation. So when we go for the natural monopoly, we mean that the monopoly which comes up over the long run when the industry enjoys cost advantage. And this cost advantage is a perennial process where without purchasing any monopoly right, natural monopoly erupts. One of the example is iron and steel industry in India, which has been operating under increasing returns to scale over a persistent period of time and ended up in the natural monopoly. So this basically gets into the consequences of economic regulation after 50 years. So when we go by the economic regulation of the theory after 50 years, then it goes back to the public reasoning to set out to capture theory of regulation, whereby as a rule, regulation is acquired by the industry, designed and operated primarily for its benefit. That means this goes back to 1971 proposition of Stigler, who says that it is simply a public choice which is capturing the theory of regulation as a rule or any legislature which is acquired by the industry, and it will be done for the benefit of it. So maintenance of the institutional status quo seems the more common industry goal, because this is how the governance or the institutional procedures can take up. Moreover, once the status quo is altered, the industry's interest will receive the disproportionate weight. This is because it is said that industries sometimes have to compromise with the externality problems. Industry sometimes has to do away with the foregoing past or the opportunity cost, because in most of the cases regulatory body also imposes restrictions like green auditing, environmental auditing, so that the environment cost cannot be degraded or environment cannot be degraded in the near future. This also goes into tune with the sustainable development, which is also one of the objective policy of the economic regulators. Moreover, it is said by the economic regulation as it is seen after 50 years that Stigler's application of public choice emphasizes the role of organized interest. Though initially it may sound that it is a private interest because the business leaders will be basically enjoying, but at the long run, organized interest will come up. What is that? Interest groups who know what their interest is, and so they can overcome barriers to collective action in the pursuit of the interest in a political arena. This is because the organized interest is a collective move with the government also participates along with the business leaders to protect the concern of all the stakeholders, and in a way takes care of the social goods like environment and society. Moreover, the emphasis on the interest groups essentially shaped the subsequent development of the theories of regulation for the next 2 decades, because that is how the regulatory policy of the body becomes more and more effective, taking care of the private interest initially, but finally culminating into the public interest as a whole. Relevance of Stigler's perspective. So what is the relevance of Stigler's perspective today? Despite the flaws and limitations, Stigler's article remains an important piece of scholarship worthy of continued engagement decades, because it comes with the work of other economists, even the political scientists, making a rational choice approach and explaining the political behavior. So it has been extended well beyond the audience of social scientists, and also the legislatures, the judges have responded to this concept of regulation, and also explaining the role of regulatory institutions. Because by the governance or social institutional capital, as we say today, one of the major pillars of factor-driven growth of any economy, social capital is very important. And there the role of regulations play an important role in terms of voice, in terms of accountability, in terms of transparency, and also in terms of the other actions that has been seen. Political stability also is one of the pillars of this governance capital. It is also said from the different strands of emerging public choice literature that political utility maximization also comes with James Buchanan and Tilloch's influential 1962 work. This is one of the extension of the Stigler theory of regulation, whereby political utility maximization, because utility maximization was based on the economic principle, but now it is coming as a common interest of the political goals or in the political agenda. Thereby, the regulatory body takes a more and more active and a proactive sense. In 1957, Anthony Downs argues that voters would be rationally ignorant about most of the public choices because of weak incentives to acquire information. So this is basically a kind of asymmetric model which can also crop up where one particular group has more information than the other, and thereby they are saying that the voters are basically having less information and they survive here. So the regulatory body comes in place and takes up this issue as one of the ways to mitigate the incomplete information. For this reason, Stigler argued that consumers were unreliable ally of rational regulator. Their stake in the regulatory outcome are too small to make them informed of pro-consumer policies or opponents of anti-consumer policies. So from the very beginning, Stigler has ignored the presence of consumers or the decisive making power of the consumers because they are always less informed, and thereby because of asymmetric information, they will not gain benefit from the regulatory agency, but because of the common interest, they are the part of the process. So in terms of benefit, they will not gain much because they are always less informed than the other group, but they will participate in this process as proposed by Stigler. So in this particular module, the discussions on the Stigler's theory is being done, which says on economic regulation. Regulation initially, according to the economic rationale, is looking after the benefit of the masses, and also it looks after an agency that comes in place. But according to Stigler, regulation will only benefit the business leaders or the corporates or the firms or the companies and not the consumers, because consumer will always lose. The perspectives of the theory were large felt whenever some kind of mechanisms that the regulators will employ to gain some kind of powers in the society, which can be done by funding, which can be done by bribery or any other practices. So Stigler only highlighted on the demand side, which will be arising from the consumers and the producers, and not on the supply side. So on the supply side, only the institutional funding has been emphasized. So the economic regulation theory, which has come up with the Platzman in 1974, was basically an extension of the Stigler theory, because thereby they said that this is basically an impoverishment. Because according to them, rational choice model develops. This rational choice model is not actually taking care of the public interest only. Because by public interest, regulatory body looks after the market failure, and that is the only incentive to have a regulatory agency. But by a rational choice model, we go for political utility maximization, where initially the political power and economic power may be different, but in the long run, they go for a common interest, and thereby the government also participates. So in terms of the economic regulation theory, after 50 years, it takes care of major stakeholders of the society, and thereby public institutional capital becomes one of the strong pillars of the growth process. So the relevance of Stigler's theory is very much there in today's world, because every economy has to go through different growth stages. So in the factor-driven stage, one of the strong pillars today is good governance, which calls for a strong regulatory body, and thereby it will also gain the capitalist classes, but also the consumers who are always less informed should also be protected in this regard. And thereby the concept of regulation, as propounded by Stigler, has been well accepted by a large amount of social scientists and political economists across the globe, with certain degree of modifications.